We're so excited about having Dana Haine join us today. She did come sort of at my last minute request when I realized, like, guys, extreme heat is not my area of expertise. The video that I had you watch of the documentary was just meant to be thought-provoking and just sort of to stimulate discussion, but I thought maybe we'd have somebody who knows a little bit more about at least the public health aspects of extreme heat than I do. So in came Dana to the rescue. Dana Brown Haine is the K-12 Science Education Manager for the Center of Public Engagement with Science at the Institute for the Environment. With a background in the biological sciences, Haine enjoys weaving her life science expertise into her passion for educating others on critical environmental science and health topics. Haine's research, translation, and curriculum development skills enable her to deliver cutting-edge environmental science content and innovation activities to K-12 students, teachers, and informal educators. Haine also contributes to the outreach efforts of the Community Engagement Core for the UNC Center for Environmental Health and Susceptibility in UNC's Gillings School of Public Health. In her role as environmental health educator, Haine shares scientific findings emerging from center scientists with K-12 audiences and members of the general public. In addition, her main focus areas include climate change education, energy education, environmental health education, and life science education. She holds an MS in biology from Wake Forest University, and her BS in biology is from Appalachian State. So with that having said, I did tell you already up front that I'm not an expert in this. I'm not an expert in any of these issues, which is why I'm bringing in subject matter experts, but I do know more about some areas than others, and extreme heat is not one of them. And also, as I alluded already to the documentary that you all watched, I do not have a toolkit to deal with those underlying issues, but as you recall, that's sort of one of the underlying themes that we've got going throughout this semester, is that it comes up again and again, no matter what the disaster is that vulnerable people are often low-income, minority, ethnic groups, all kinds of disparities, disabled, whatever the vulnerability group is, they are impacted more dramatically from most natural hazards that occur. So having said that, I do want to take this opportunity really quick. Dana, indulge me for just another moment, because I realize this documentary comes from way out in left field. There's no denying the liberal slant that it has. And I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable if you have, a contrary viewpoint or stance on that. So I know that's hard at this university in particular, but a lot of universities. But a conservative viewpoint is valid, and I welcome all types of responses that you guys have. And in fact, that might make it more interesting. Okay, I'm going to shut my mouth and let Dana take it away. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So it's nice to meet everyone. I know a few of you in the class because of work you've done at the Institute for the Environment. So it's neat to have a few familiar faces. And I will definitely say I'm no expert on extreme heat, but I do education around climate change. And I've been doing that since 2007 with the Institute for the Environment. And that includes awareness of how climate impacts health. And so one thing I'm trying to do today in my remarks to you is to show you some of the kind of strategies that I use to teach about extreme heat and health by talking about how that climate impact intersects with other climate impacts, like air quality, for instance. So we're going to be thinking about how these really aren't siloed topics. And also when I am, teaching about these impacts, we always talk about vulnerable populations. We talk about the importance of bringing all voices to the table when making decisions. So I feel like hopefully today I will be giving you showing you some ways that you maybe could talk about these issues with others. And also I'll be featuring some of the work that's happening at UNC around this issue, which some of you might be interested in. And I'll also be providing giving you a current sense of some resources you could look to if you are particularly interested in this topic. And then with summer coming quickly, it'll be 90 degrees before we know it. I think hopefully this topic and this talk will kind of open your eyes to looking for things this summer in our communities as they deal with extreme heat. So I do outreach for the Center for Environmental Health and Susceptibility. And one of the things I recently did was I developed an online training module for public health professionals on the intersection between extreme heat and air quality. And so I'll be incorporating some of that content into the talk today. I did watch the Cooked documentary as well, and I'll sprinkle in some of my thoughts into that talk also. So we're going to try something brand new here. I'm going to drop in the chat box a link to a NearPod activity. And if you can go there, you probably have to enter your name. And I have to figure out how to kind of minimize this so I can see my screen. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. So if you'll go to that NearPod, and here I ask you to just enter where you went to high school. So I want to know kind of where everyone's from, so to speak. And that's going to relate to this topic. So just go ahead and enter in where you are. And of course I have to figure out how to see this myself. So maybe, there you go, here it comes.
How do you enter in where you are or where you went to?
You just go to that little pink plus sign on the right. Do you see it?
Yeah, I got it. Thanks.
Yeah, and you can just type in your city. And I thought this could be neat for today's discussion, just to see where everyone went to high school, thinking that this is probably in your recent memory. And I'll wait another couple seconds here. So if you've already entered and as you're reflecting, I just want you to think about how we might have experienced extreme heat differently, depending on where we grew up. What did extreme heat mean in your community? So a number of us are from, North Carolina, from the center part of the state. It looks like, we know that it's oftentimes 90, 95 degrees. It's hot, it's humid. But that could be very different from what an extreme heat day might look like in California, right? Or even Arizona. So I don't know if the person from California wants to chime in. And what did extreme heat mean for you in high school? What was an extreme heat day? Just feel free to unmute yourself.
That was me. I grew up in Oakland, California. I don't really remember extreme heat days. I mean, none of us had air conditioning. Mm-hmm. So I remember there were some days, I haven't lived there since 2012. But there are some days growing up where it was impossible to fall asleep. Mm-hmm. But that was maybe 3 days during the summer or something. Yeah. I'm sure it's worse now, but I don't remember it being a too bad during the with classes and things like that or mm-hmm. anything.
Mm-hmm. I remember being at a meeting several years ago. The meeting was actually in San Francisco, and I was hearing about their climate action plan, and they were talking about extreme heat days being at 80 degrees. And I was like, what? 80 degrees is not extreme heat, But then I realized, that people don't have air conditioning. A lot of people live in high rises, and that extreme heat in that area really was at a much cooler temperature than what we would call extreme heat in North Carolina. So that was really eye-opening for me to think about how we all experience extreme heat differently depending on what we're kind of acclimated to. And the person in Maine, probably similar, right? Extreme heat might be at a much lower threshold. So that's just one reason for this activity. is just to get us thinking. And again, someone's from Arizona here. I don't know if you want to chime in about what extreme heat was in Arizona. I think many of us have a sense of that.
Hi, that was me. Yeah, so luckily we lived near the mountains,
Okay.
so it wasn't as extreme as Phoenix.
Yeah.
But it was definitely, I mean, there were days of 110 plus.
Right.
So.
And the heat out there is much drier, if I remember correctly. So it might be hotter than it is here, but the dryness, it feels different. And it seems like you all can tolerate that high temperature a little better than if it were 110 here with humidity, for instance. So humidity really adds a layer of complexity to how we experience heat. So thanks for doing that. Y'all are it's nice that we had a spectrum of people here. One more question for you. And this is just where you'll enter a response and a bunch of Post-it notes will pop up. So I just want to kind of brainstorm, how does extreme heat impact communities? So think about people, but also think about natural and built environment. So I just want to kind of get us to think beyond just heat and heat-related illness, but what else does heat do? How else does it impact us? So maybe just throw up the first thing that comes to mind. Hopefully you can read each other's answers. Yeah, I was wondering if someone was going to talk about impacts to the power grid, being unable to exercise, roads to buckle. Good. I was wanting someone to think about impacts to infrastructure. So roads, the power grid, more use of energy, right? Y'all are good. Shifting work schedules, impacts to animals and wildlife, safety, not wanting to open windows, social isolation, right? And really, this is what we want people to do, right? We want them to really think about these issues more holistically, because when we do that, we can then think more about who's vulnerable, what people are vulnerable, what ecosystems are vulnerable, what aspects of our built environment are vulnerable. So we want this kind of holistic view, and we don't want to just focus, I think, on heat-related illness, because then we're going to not pay attention to other things we need to pay attention to. Power outages can be big for people who rely on, electric medical equipment at home, say. So that's something else to keep in mind as well. All right, so thanks for doing that for me. I'm going to close out of that and then share my screen again. All right. So I have a number of slides and I'm going to just try to move through them quickly. I would love for this to be informal. So feel free to drop questions into chat or unmute yourself. I do not mind, honestly. I'm an educator at heart, but Zoom is still new to me, not being on Zoom, but teaching on Zoom. So definitely feel free to participate. So just wanted to start out, we talked a little bit about what extreme heat feels like a few minutes ago. In North Carolina, especially in central North Carolina, they've kind of defined what is extreme heat. And in our state, typically the air temperature exceeds 95 degrees, the heat index is above 105, and the heat index takes into account temperature and humidity. And typically we'll get heat warnings if there's going to be a heat index above 105 for more than 3 hours for one or more days. And then a heat wave, of course, is consecutive days of extreme heat. And I think I've lived in North Carolina my whole life, and I can definitely say the summers have gotten hotter. I don't remember hardly any 100-degree days when I was little, but now it's pretty common and almost expected, right? So the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, they do have CDC funding through their BRACE program to do some climate and health work. This is from their 2015 report, and it's in line with other more recent reports, but I just liked this summary. This is kind of what our state is preparing for: more extreme heat days, 15 to 20 more extreme heat days annually, and then more consecutive extreme heat days. So that's 4 to 12 more consecutive heat days annually as well. So from a planning perspective, we need to plan for these events, but also these multi-day events, right? Two more recent reports that might be of interest to you all. These are both released last year, the North Carolina Climate Science Report, where you can go for science and impacts that North Carolina is expecting, and then also the North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan. And some of the content in today's talk are from these places. So you might be interested in checking these out. This is from the Climate Science Report, just graphically or visually showing how we're expected to see more very hot days. These are days with temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And remember, even though the mountains there don't look like they're going to be, you know, severely impacted, remember, like the California person, a lot of these homes don't have air conditioning. So even at temperatures below 95, you can still have extreme heat episodes and health effects. This is just showing the same data really for the state, projected 100-degree days by 2100. So you can also see the areas of the country that are really going to be looking even more at extreme heat strategies for resilience. And then heat wave projections. So these are multi-day heat events. And then another thing that sometimes people don't think about is warmer nights. This means warmer nights. These are days where the minimum temperature stays above 75 degrees Fahrenheit. These are those hot nights where you have trouble sleeping, you just don't get much relief. And so why do we care about this? Does anyone know why this might matter?
Your body doesn't get a chance to recover.
Yeah, it's hard, especially if you work outdoors, right? Your body needs that recovery period. And if it's staying warm at night, if you don't have air conditioning, you don't get a good night's sleep. So it can really impact the body's ability to cool itself. It can also have impact on plants and wildlife. They too need that opportunity to cool off. So there can be ecosystem effects as well. So this is why it's a concern also. And some people, I don't think, know this. They think we focus a lot on the hot days, but not the hot nights. And this is just a quote from the report: warmer nights reduce relief from the heat of the day and increasing heat-related stress on public health. And so again, the most vulnerable people are going to be those who don't have air conditioning at night, right? Who don't have the ability to cool off. Or maybe they have to work at night. This is a wordy slide, and I'm sorry about it. I just didn't have the time to do more, but something else we want to think about is what this means for our water resources. So, right, a lot of extreme heat is going to impact our water supplies, could lead to drought. It'll increase demands for water as more people water their lawns, for instance. It can also increase the risk and frequency of wildfires, and that can, and it can also impact habitats for animals that rely on wetlands and other aquatic ecosystems. So again, it's where we don't want to just think about extreme heat as a siloed thing. We want to think about how it impacts all these other systems. And something that I do in my work for the Center for Environmental Health and Susceptibility is we think about air quality. And we have a number of world-renowned air quality researchers at UNC. So here's another question I'll pose to you all. Why do hot days often mean bad air days? And this is a snapshot of a news report, I think from 2019. Any thoughts on why this might be?
I don't really have, this is a guess, but maybe, exhaust and different things coming from running engines and different equipment to keep cool.
Yep, that's part of it. So definitely emissions. So what often happens, and this is especially true in the Southeast, is heat waves happen because it means that still, humid, stagnant air has settled in over an area. And that stagnant air is going to be ideal for trapping emissions, right? So all those tailpipe emissions from these cars, they don't really go anywhere. They stay around the ground. They lead to ground level ozone production, which is not good for our health. All those emissions also lead to particle pollution, and that's what creates this haze here. This is particle pollution and ozone, neither of which are good for our respiratory health. So in the Southeast, especially, heat waves are oftentimes accompanied by that still and stagnant air. So that's something you might want to pay attention to this summer. If we have one of these extreme heat days, take a look at air quality and see if you can kind of see evidence of that correlation. This is another little visual I like, and this is also connects to research happening at UNC, that as the temperature and as sunlight increases throughout the day, the sunlight kind of bakes that pollution, and it actually can become more toxic. So we have researchers at UNC who have showed that they know the atmospheric chemistry, and they know that the sunlight is creating more toxic pollution, which can be even worse for our lungs. So what this leads to, and here's another graph just showing air stagnation events are increasing in North Carolina. I think the statistic is we're expected to have like 40 or more stagnant days per year or something by 2050. So this is another thing that we're going to have to deal with, is not just heat waves, but poor air quality days as well. It turns out, so something that surprised me about the Cook documentary was I don't think there was any reference to air quality. And it was a heat wave, but it was also poor air quality because it was this hot, humid air mass just sat over Chicago in 1995. And this is a picture from the July 1995 heat wave. So more than likely, some of the deaths that they attribute, and these are screenshots from the film, these are all asthma, cardiovascular disease, emphysema. These are our cardiovascular respiratory diseases, and heat and air pollution can exacerbate these diseases. So probably what sent some of those people to the hospital and ultimately caused their death was that the heat and the air pollution combined ultimately led to their demise. So that's something else, we want to be aware of. And I thought it was interesting that that connection wasn't addressed, or I don't remember it being addressed in the documentary. And again, we tend to want to silo those issues, but they're certainly connected. And so you can see here, our vulnerable populations are the ones mentioned in the documentary. Children, people of low socioeconomic status, the elderly are especially vulnerable, but also people with those pre-existing conditions. Something else that's worth pointing out that I've included in my module is that some medications that people might be on also might impair their body's ability to thermoregulate itself. So healthcare providers need to know to tell their patients, like, it's going to be hot this weekend, because you're on this heart medicine, maybe you should stay indoors during the hottest part of the day. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. And this is a quote from Jason West, who's an air quality researcher at UNC. And I'll just read it really quickly. Extreme heat and poor air quality each have their own health effects, but there are suggestions from previous research, this is still a new area, that heat and air pollution may affect health synergistically. So the net effect on health is greater than the sum of the individual effects. So this is, I'd say, kind of a cutting edge area of research. And nowhere is this kind of more relevant than in cities, in our urban environments, because of the air pollution, like from emissions that was mentioned earlier. Any questions so far? Is any of this new information or maybe something you haven't thought about previously? So again, if you're interested in air quality, you are sitting at UNC with robust air quality research. So I'm happy to talk with you further about that offline if you're interested in finding out maybe who to connect with. This is
Dana. Oh, it occurs to me that one of the reasons this particular health impact was not mentioned in the film is that because you noticed that it was emerging research. They may not have known about it, or at least had enough evidence to talk about it at that time.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably certainly true for 1995, but then I thought the documentary, I think, was released last year, so I was surprised.
Yeah, but how much did they change
Yes.
it before
Yeah.
it got around to
Yeah,
showing up on PBS.
Definitely. This is just a graphic I like. You can see extreme heat in the center, also poor air quality, but this just shows how complicated it is. When you're thinking about vulnerabilities, like on the right here, social behavioral context, these are all vulnerabilities that are going to ultimately impact how communities respond to these different events, like extreme heat, for instance. So this is just a nice, again, holistic view of all the things we want to think about when we're thinking about these climate impacts. And then again, these impacts are going to differ depending on if we're talking about urban versus rural population. So people living in high rises are going to experience extreme heat differently from people living in the suburbs. And we have migrant farm workers in our state. We have outdoor workers. We have a lot of people who live in mobile homes. So these are all vulnerable populations for different reasons. There are people working at the state level to try to forecast and understand where extreme heat events occur to a greater extent, like where should we prioritize our efforts. So this is convergence.unc.edu is another UNC product. Chip Conrad and his group out of geography are putting together a number of tools for public health professionals and city and regional officials. This is just showing the number of extreme heat events in our state. And like you probably would expect as you go towards the coast, we have more and more extreme heat events. A graduate student a few years ago with Dr. Conrad developed this map. This is looking at emergency department data for heat-related illness. And again, you see that most of the majority of emergency department visits are happening in the coastal plain there, the orange and red areas, the sandhills in particular. So there are a lot of farm workers, outdoor workers, and others in that region. So heat illness was 8 to 10 times higher in rural areas than in cities. There's a heat safety app I discovered for outdoor workers, and I just point that out here. They look at heat index. You might not be able to see that. So the heat index is combining temperature and humidity. So it is there are some tools that can protect outdoor workers from heat. And I want to just share with you, Dr. Conrad at UNC is working on something called wet bulb globe temperature tool. This tool, he did not create the tool. But he's creating this forecast thing, this little graph you see on the right. Wet bulb globe temperature takes into account 2 additional factors, wind speed and intensity of sunlight. So it gives you a better sense of how hot it's going to feel to someone outside. And they're promoting this new tool, especially to high school athletes, so that they know to not practice when it's in black there, for instance. So this is a new tool that you can keep your eye on this summer. I think it's only available in May through September.
We do have a question in the
I
chat
saw that.
if you want me to jump on it.
Yeah, and I don't know, my heat-related illness, I think typically is related to when your body can't thermoregulate properly, right? And there's different things like heat stroke and heat exhaustion. Asthma is certainly going to be different, and heat can exacerbate asthma. So I think, but it would be interesting to see how they kind of segregate that out on your medical files. I don't know if anyone knows the answer. But typically with heat-related illness, you're really focusing on the body's ability to not regulate its temperature properly. And depending on the degree of severity, you'll have different impacts. Oh, good. Julia's going to look it up. Chip is your advisor. Good. So tell Chip that I was promoting all his products. All right. Urban populations, like I mentioned, they're also vulnerable because of something called the urban heat island effect, increased urbanization, there's traffic emissions that we talked about, and then you have an aging population. And this is the urban heat island effect. This is just known that cities are much hotter than the surrounding land because of all of the asphalt and concrete and the tall buildings. So this is just, we're trapping that heat in, and if there's pollution, we're trapping that pollution. This is another trend that we're seeing happen across the country, and I think Raleigh is trying to do this sometime soon, is urban heat island mapping. So this is Richmond, Virginia. This is a citizen science project where they were mapping, which neighborhoods were most vulnerable to extreme heat. And a lot of times, and this is not just looking at extreme heat, but looking at other factors that contribute to vulnerability. So again, as planners, this would help you prioritize, where do you want to plant trees? Where do you want to plant put cooling structures, etc. These are some strategies for reducing urban heat island effect. You might have heard of some of these. This is a photo of people working in Los Angeles, I think, painting the pavement a lighter color to reflect more sunlight. So cool roofs, green roofs, cool pavements, and just greening, creating shade and more trees. And I'm right at 4:30, so I know I still have a number of slides, but I'm going to try to go quickly and make this even more interactive. When I teach about resilience, I teach about these 3 prongs. I don't know how Anna teaches about resilience, but I teach about climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and social cohesion. And so really quickly, climate mitigation, these are going to be things we can do to reduce extreme heat by reducing those heat trapping gases we put into the atmosphere. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. You're probably familiar with a lot of these. This is where renewable energy would come in, for instance. Adaptation are going to be things we're going to do to reduce our harm to a certain climate impact and prepare for future impacts. So this is a cooling structure on a farm to give farmers a chance to cool off, for instance. And then social cohesion is something that you might not always think about or might not always be presented with resilience, but it's basically fostering the capacity for the community to help each other and respond and just get stronger through its social connection. So it's in the Cook documentary, they talked about neighbors checking on neighbors, being an example of something that promotes social cohesion.
As at least one of the questions that was pre-submitted pointed out, how do you do that during COVID?
Say that, oh, right, yeah, well, that's certainly a challenge, right?
Right, exactly.
And so, educational campaigns, social media, having like a, text chain with people, in your neighborhood or on your, like for high rises, I've heard they have like floor captains, for instance. So yeah, you have to get creative for sure.
Back in the day, we used to have telephone trees.
Yes, I remember that. And it looks like Julia did put an answer to the question. So apparently anything containing at least one heat-related code, like heat stroke, etc. Okay, so heat-related illness. Okay. So I guess asthma would still be separate. All right. This is a list that came from the CDC's Climate and Health Program. These are kind of the categories for climate adaptation. So what are communities doing? I've already mentioned a few of these, like the mapping, the surveillance system, for instance, and I thought we could just talk through a couple of these today. When you're thinking about an adaptation strategy, these are some questions you might want to ask. Does the strategy have co-benefits? And these are kind of sometimes thought of as no regrets. There's just multiple good things about doing something. Does it have negative consequences? Who will it benefit, and is it fair? Sometimes our strategies might only benefit a certain subset of people. And so that's where, in terms of being equitable, we really want to make sure we're not leaving vulnerable groups behind when we implement certain solutions. So how do you pick strategies? There's some list here, looking at cost, co-benefits, equity and fairness, etc. And I just have a couple here to think about. Cooling centers, of course, are mentioned a lot. And with COVID, that gets complicated, right? But something else I want you all to think about are some other side effects. Thinking about air quality, an idling bus might be a great cooling center, but it's also going to have exhaust. And if people are hanging out around it, and they have asthma or COPD or heart disease, it might not be a wise idea. So to me, when I saw this, I was like, oh, I don't know if that's the best idea. But again, you have to weigh, like, maybe it is better to have a bus cooling center than no cooling center at all. But it's wanting to just think about all those kind of ripple effects. And then I took this from the documentary. I was so interested. I was actually quite amazed by just the vast number of white people making decisions, not just here, but in the movie when they were talking about emergency response plans. I did not see diverse people making decisions in the film. Here they were talking about cooling centers. So they asked, do you have a lot of people using the area police headquarters as cooling stations? And the man's response was, we've offered that, but there's not a great number of people who've come in to take advantage of it. There's really very little explanation for it. So let's think about that for a minute. Why do you think that might not have been the best location for a cooling station in Chicago? Any guesses? Probably.
Put a comment in.
Yeah,
the
people
chat.
don't want to come. Yes, right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't trust the police, right? We know this very clearly now, and I would imagine we knew it back in 1995. But to open police headquarters as a cooling station, you're right there. People are just not gonna feel safe going there. So you have, if you're gonna put cooling centers in, one, you need to understand where in your community do you need to put them, like where are your vulnerable populations, and then providing locations that feel safe and that they can access. If they have to take public transportation and spend $2 to get there, are they gonna go? So you really have to think about access and safety and perception. So it's pretty complicated, actually, I think, to think about where the best places to put cooling centers. Another thing you sometimes see is they provide fans and AC units to low-income households. And then they find out that the people don't use them because they can't pay their electric bill. So again, it's understanding the vulnerable populations and what their needs are and meeting them where their needs are. This is also from the Convergence website. This shows energy poverty. This is how some people who are living, 50% below poverty level, they're spending in North Carolina an average of 30% of their income on energy. So to give them a fan and expect them to run it to protect themselves is not realistic if they feel like they can't pay their electric bill. So helping them pay their electric bills might be a better solution. Also, I was struck in the film about how, a lot of them didn't feel like they could open their windows because it wasn't safe. So again, recognizing that that's an issue and then working at it from that perspective. Urban greening is another one. These are lots of different examples here. Lots of benefits are associated with urban greening. You all probably know this and can see this happen in Durham, where I live right now. We have recognized that some of our most vulnerable communities don't have a lot of trees. So they're wanting to plant trees, but some of the residents don't want trees because they don't want the maintenance and the upkeep that comes from having the trees. So it's complicated. And then I like this solution from Phoenix, promoting umbrellas as personal shade devices and, potentially passing these out to homeless people, people who really need them in the urban environment. Here's a little art contest where they were having an umbrella art contest. I was even thinking you could use the umbrellas and have educational messages on them. So I thought this was a creative solution. And then another one was just modifying work schedules of employees. And this was from the Phoenix article that some of you might have seen, and about how the night is just coming alive in Phoenix because it's so hot during the day. But you could think about what some of the negative consequences of this might mean. Some people might not see their children, right? If they have to work at night and their children are in school at day, so that could impair family structure and mental health. Something else we haven't really talked about are the mental health connections as well, and the connections to crime, et cetera. So I just picked a few examples here just to get us thinking that these solutions, they're not always perfect. Some are better than others. And when we're thinking about solutions, we have to think about them really as holistically as we can. And we need to have as many different voices at the table as we can, especially the ones who are going to be most directly impacted. And I think that's it. And another one was a lot of people are revising their emergency response plans to include extreme heat events as well. So that's it. I think hopefully I did okay on time. I know y'all have some questions, and maybe some of the examples came up for you as well. Maybe you have other examples that you've seen in your community, since y'all are from all over the country. New York City, I know, has super hot extreme heat events. It looks like some of you are from that area. So I'd welcome, hearing from you all about some strategies you've seen, either that have worked well or maybe that have not been perfect, because they weren't, implemented really with community input. So thank you. Here's my email, and then I'll turn it over to you to kind of moderate.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I just noticed that Emma had put in one of her questions dealt with the long-term health impacts of, or the implications of switching to nighttime work for people. And in addition to the effects that you mentioned, impacts on circadian rhythms, eyesight, mental health. The not seeing your children was that didn't occur to me, but sure, yeah. I mean, who's going to put them to bed and whatnot? So there's lots of professions that do deal with this all the time. But not everybody. So it'd be a hard switch.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, and we probably don't know all the consequences in a way of shifting a lot of people more to nighttime work. But yeah, certainly we know that, shift work in a lighted facility like a hospital at night is a known carcinogen. So, if you're working outdoors at night, maybe it's different because you are getting the moonlight perhaps. But it's interesting to think about how we might not know all those consequences yet.
Sure. I'm going to take off your sharing, so we can see more boxes.
Perfect.
So what I'm going to do, instead of calling out the questions, because I think I've hit everybody at least once so far in this semester, and again, participation being part of your grade, it's one of the ways that I can make sure that everyone has ample opportunity to participate. But if you haven't had the chance to bring up a question to a speaker directly, stick up a hand, and I'll give you priority. But I've been trying to keep track, and I think I've hit everybody. Okay, anybody feel neglected and left out in the cold so far? Okay. Well, then what I'm going to do is just call it open season, raise a hand, stick it in the chat. And so just let us know that you've got something to say. And we'll do it that way. We'll see if we get a little more dialogue going.
I have a quick question.
Great.
So I'm working with a group at the Water Institute at UNC, and we're looking at disaster recovery and resiliency, and we're looking at heat waves, specifically flooding and drought. And we've been trying to look at the different governance levels, like at the federal, North Carolina, and local levels, and we were having a hard time finding consistent information about heat waves, just because there are varying definitions of what a heat wave is.
Yes.
So I was just wondering sort of what avenues can we explore with trying to capture statistics and deaths and things like that? Do you know of any?
Well, I know that are you talking about for extreme heat? I guess. I mean, so Chip Conrad and his group, he'd be a good person to connect with. And that paper I mentioned with Maggie Suggs from 2016, where they looked at emergency department data, there is a tool called NC Detect, where they can track, different types of coded, hospital visits. So, I don't know if that type of data is what you're talking about, but looking at emergency department data where you can pull certain codes and then look across the state and look in your region. And then Chip might be a good person to connect with just in terms of defining extreme heat, because it is defined differently depending on where you are. And in North Carolina, that's challenging because our state spans from the mountains to the coast. So yeah, an extreme heat day in Raleigh is different from one in Boone, for instance. Does that answer your question? I don't know if it does.
Yeah, I think I need to get up with Chip. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. Anyone
I
else?
feel like he's in the room.
I know. He could be your next time you need an extreme heat person. I mean, it is neat to see. It is a relevant issue for our state, and our state is certainly working on it. But again, especially with COVID, right? Like resources are strained. And so, you know, some counties, like the one map I showed you from HERA, the HERA tool, hazard exposure risk assessment tool, that is intended in part to help counties determine, you know, which climate hazards are most likely to happen in their county and where should they prioritize their resources. And so that's the Convergence website. And it's if you go to that website, there's a tool section, and then HERA is one of the tools. And you can look at things there other than extreme heat too. They have other things, but so there is stuff happening. And so that's good to know about. Did someone else have a question that I kind of cut them off?
Yeah, I had a question. So I'm thinking about in terms of like climate change adaptation, and like kind of drawing a parallel to parcel buyouts with like repeated flooding properties.
Yeah.
And within that, I'm starting to think about, is it possible for extreme heat events and the increase in extreme heat events to prompt in the long term some sort of climate migration? I mean, I know that as a country, we're not good at like saying, no, we can't live here anymore.
Yeah.
But is there a point where like areas of Phoenix, the city is just like, okay, we just can't support development here anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And it would be interesting to know. I would think to some extent that could be happening, where like, especially maybe with people who are less connected to an area and they feel like, okay, I'm going to choose to move from Phoenix. But some people, and I've learned this from other work that we've done, some people are really tied to their land, right? They have family histories there and they don't want to leave. Like we work with people who live on contaminated land, drinking contaminated water, but it's their family and, you know, home. And I think we have to recognize that too. So I think it probably is depending upon, you know, how they're looking at where they live, whether it's if they're tied to it from that sense, or is it easier to move? But I would imagine for people who are looking to relocate, it could certainly over time impact how many people are moving into an area, right? I could see, like, I don't want to live in Phoenix because I don't like being in a hot, dry environment. I think I'd rather be here in the humid Carolinas. Yeah, so I don't know. Does anyone know if that's happening in Phoenix or if they're monitoring it? I bet someone is.
Well, some new census data would be very helpful in this situation, but it looks like that might be a while.
It'd be interesting to look at Australia. I don't know how many of y'all have remember when Australia had some super hot days like a year or two ago, and they had to add a new color to their temperature map. They had to add like purple because it got so hot. And it was interesting.
Yeah, and really closely related to the wildfire.
Yeah.
Which,
so it's interesting to know how that impacted, you know, migration.
Anybody else have anything before I resort to my list? Okay.
Yeah,
Kels?
I had one. Like watching the documentary and kind of reading through the stuff, it looks like there's like a big kind of mismatch between where we're allocating funds. Like people are buying a lot of new shiny stuff and that's what it's more like preparedness. But like, are there examples of places that are putting those funds more towards, you know, like listening to communities, listening to what they need, or like what are those financing mechanisms look like? What should people be doing better at?
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, it struck me watching that from 1995. I feel like we're better than that now. I don't know. But I mean, it really did show how, they were preparing for a tornado, which was a rare occurrence, right, in that area. And I do think, at least in North Carolina, and I'm sure in other states, I do think because resources are more limited, people are being more diligent about which hazards they're going to prepare for. I know, for instance, the Department of Health and Human Services, Lauren Fee, is doing climate and health work at the state level with CDC funding. And I know that they're directing their extreme heat work to the Sandhills region, for instance, because that was where, like Maggie Suggs' work, showed that that was a really vulnerable area. So even within North Carolina, we're not seeing necessarily statewide, actions related to extreme heat, but targeted actions to certain areas and to certain vulnerable populations.
Like a lot of things, it is rather political. I worked on the state's hazard mitigation plan years ago, and I don't recall that extreme heat was actually in it. If it was not emphasized. Drought, yes, drought was addressed, and I'm talking about a long time ago. This might have been 15 years ago. But the one hazard that somebody within the Division of Emergency Management really wanted in there was asteroid hit.
Yeah.
Okay, A, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. And B, the odds of it are not able to calculate it this time. Most end up in the ocean when they do hit Earth. But we always got a real big chuckle out of that. It's just, what the heck? Let's put our resources into something.
Yeah. And I think that leads to, as citizens, that's where we can hold our policymakers accountable, like paying attention to what's happening at the local level. What are they paying attention to? Like in Durham, I know they're paying attention to the tree canopy, for instance, recognizing the numerous benefits of urban greening.
As long as the tree limbs don't fall on the power lines.
Right. But so I think just paying attention to what they're focusing on and calling them out, if you think they're going down the wrong path. Yeah. But right now, the thing is, we have so many competing things, on the coast, they're dealing with sea level rise and flooding and hurricanes. I mean, it's just hard to do it all really well. But an educated population is super important as well.
Yeah. I mean, I've done some studies on what it takes in terms of political will. And the electoral cycle is so short that to get elected again, a lot of officials, not all, but a lot of officials, particularly at the local level where things really hit the ground, are willing to put money into things like preparedness and response, because that's a glitzy thing and it's immediate impact, and everybody can see how wonderful the municipality was in rescuing people after a flood or whatnot. Whereas long-term adaptation and mitigation, much harder sell.
Yeah.
Even though eventually it'll save money, but that's a harder sell.
Yeah, we're such a reactive society, and we need to be way more proactive. But that does require long-term thinking, planning, and sometimes projects that could take years to really, develop and implement.
Anybody have any comments along those lines or anything else? I know a couple of you kind of touched on that political aspect of disaster in general, which often relates all the way back to our vulnerable populations and how we treat them.
Kind of just a comment again.
Sure.
Referring back to like the shiny, like the vehicle or like the preparedness kind of stuff. It reminded me of like reading news stories about how police departments misallocate funds and buy like a lot of flashy, cool stuff. Yeah, that's all.
This was incredibly apparent after 9/11, where the entire emergency management ecosystem switched from dealing with natural hazards or things like hazardous chemical spills to a really man up armor protection for all kinds of local and statewide events, which may or may not happen. But, you know, in our field, in the natural hazards field, we were saying, well, okay, let's be prepared. Terrorism is the thing, or violent outbursts in the United States is a thing, but we really know hurricanes are a thing and they are going to be coming. Some years worse than others, or just dealing with known hazards. But that was really where all the money went, was into armoring, as opposed to continuing mitigation activities that had been started.
And I think too, Hurricane Sandy, I think, was a real wake-up call as well for communities. I worked with some communities in New York, like in Harlem, where that was where they realized, like, we need floor captains in our high rises. We need signage to keep people informed. So it's, you know, even though it's a hurricane, it's different from extreme heat, but I think there's still lessons that can be learned from these big events about how to cultivate social cohesion, for instance, and how to pick and choose solutions, and how to prioritize, and how to do, you know, just participatory decision making. So I think it's been interesting for me, and I do feel like 9/11, Hurricane Sandy, which was 2012, like some of these big events, and COVID is also just really revealing, right, all of the vulnerabilities in our societies, and we can take those lessons learned and apply them to all these different kinds of impacts.
Yeah.
So
anybody else have any questions along those lines or otherwise?
I was curious about whether, you know, if there's been any studies done into thinking of all the different strategies that you laid out. Sorry, I just realized you probably can't hear me very well. My audio is bad. I'll try to talk loud.
I can hear you.
Strategies you laid out. Have there been studies done of which ones are in general being prioritized, and why? Because I think, from my own personal perspective, I think of things like energy retrofits and helping people pay for their energy bills as, you know, long-term more effective than.
Yeah, there probably are. And I think that CDC Climate and Health Program, the story map that you all got, I think that'd be a good place to go, because a lot of those grantees are publishing then on their work. And I think they have generated some white papers and things as well, comparing best practices. So I think that would probably be a good place to go first. And I'll have to try to think of some other places. But yeah, I think I mean, it's going to be so different depending on where you are. But I think that that type of information will be really helpful to help, you know, municipalities know where to put when they have money, where's the best place to put it. And another thing that's common in some places is that participatory budgeting, where you ask for community input. Where does your community want you to spend money? Durham did that a year or two ago, where we got to vote on how it allocated funds. And that, you know, that gives the community members a voice. So that's another, you know, it's a little bit of a different spin on your question. But yeah, I would say the CDC seems to be one of the best places you could go to hear what all the grantees are learning on the ground as they try to build resilience in their communities. And that's called the BRACE program. So you could also look more at there might be a separate BRACE website too, different than the story map one you saw.